How can a book quoted in the New Testament be missing from most Bibles today? How can a text that shaped ancient Jewish thought, influenced early Christian imagination, and told one of the most shocking stories in all religious literature simply vanish from the canon most believers know? And perhaps the strangest question of all, if the Book of Enoch was considered important enough to be read, copied, discussed, and preserved for centuries, why did so many traditions leave it out? Tonight, we are stepping into one of the most controversial mysteries in biblical history. The Book of Enoch is filled with fallen angels, heavenly secrets, divine judgment, cosmic visions, and the terrifying story of the Watchers, beings who descended to Earth, corrupted humanity, and helped unleash chaos before the flood. It is dramatic, unsettling, and unlike almost anything most people expect to find near the world of the Bible. And yet, this mysterious book was known in antiquity. It was read in Jewish circles. It was familiar to early Christians. Fragments of it were even found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. One New Testament letter appears to quote it directly. So why is it absent from most modern Bibles? Before we uncover that mystery, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments right now, do you think the Book of Enoch was unfairly excluded? Or do you think it never belonged in the Bible at all? I want to know where you stand before we go deeper, because once you understand what this book says, and why it was embraced by some and rejected by others, you may never look at the edges of the biblical world the same way again. First, we need to clear up a common misconception. The Book of Enoch was not removed from the Bible in the simple way many people imagine. That word makes it sound as if it was universally accepted into Scripture and then later cut out by a hidden decision. The historical reality is more complicated and more interesting. The Book of Enoch was never part of the canon in most branches of Judaism or in most Christian traditions. But it was highly respected in certain circles, widely read in the ancient world, and preserved as scripture in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So the real question is not simply who removed it. The real question is, why did this book remain influential while still failing to become part of the biblical canon for most believers? To answer that, we have to understand what the Book of Enoch actually is. What people call one Enoch is not a single simple book written in one moment by the Enoch mentioned in Genesis. It is a collection of writings composed over time, probably between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century BC. Though the traditions behind some sections may be older, it is attributed to Enoch, the mysterious figure who walked with God and was taken by God before death. That alone gave the work enormous symbolic power. A man so ancient, so enigmatic, so close to heaven, who would not want to know what secrets he supposedly saw. And the book delivers exactly that kind of mystery. It expands on the brief and cryptic account found in Genesis 6, where the sons of God take the daughters of men, and the Nephilim appear on the earth. In Enoch, these shadowy verses explode into a full narrative. The sons of God become the Watchers, a group of rebellious heavenly beings who descend to Mount Hermon, swear an oath together, take human wives, and produce giant offspring. These giants consume the labor of humanity, spread violence, devour creation, and plunge the world into bloodshed. Meanwhile, the Watchers reveal forbidden knowledge, sorcery, weapon-making, enchantments, astrology, and hidden arts that corrupt mankind. In other words, the Book of Enoch takes one of the Bible's shortest mysteries and turns it into a vast supernatural drama. That is one reason the book has never stopped fascinating readers. It gives names to the rebels. It gives motives to the fall. It paints the pre-flood world as not merely sinful, but invaded, distorted, and overwhelmed by a rebellion that touched both heaven and earth. It also describes divine judgment against these fallen beings, presenting them as chained, condemned, and awaiting final punishment. For many readers, this helps explain why the world before the flood became so corrupt so quickly. But for others, it raises a serious concern. Is this inspired revelation, or is it religious imagination expanding beyond what Scripture itself actually says? That question lies at the center of why Enoch became controversial. Now here is where the mystery becomes even more intriguing. The Book of Enoch was not some forgotten fringe text unknown to the ancient world. It was influential. Fragments of Enoch were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means Jewish communities connected to Qumran considered it significant enough to preserve. Early Christian writers were aware of it. Some even treated it with deep respect. And then there is the most famous detail of all. The New Testament letter of Jude appears to quote Enoch directly when it says, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all." That sounds dramatic on its own. But it also creates a problem. If a New Testament author quotes Enoch, Does that mean Enoch should be in the Bible? Not necessarily. The Bible sometimes quotes or alludes to sources that are not themselves canonical. Quoting a text does not automatically elevate the entire work to Scripture. Paul, for example, quotes pagan poets at times, but no one argues that those poets should therefore be included in the Bible. Jude's use of Enoch shows that the text was known and meaningful in some circles, but it does not, by itself, settle the question of canon. Still, it does make the issue harder to ignore, because the Book of Enoch was clearly not irrelevant. So why did most traditions leave it out? The first major reason is authorship. The book claims association with Enoch, a figure who lived before the flood. But scholars and religious authorities across history recognized that the text itself was composed much later. This is what is often called pseudepigraphy, a work written under the name of a famous ancient figure in the ancient world that was not always treated the same way modern readers would treat forgery. But it did raise serious questions about authority. If Enoch himself did not literally write the book, should it be treated as prophetic scripture or as a later religious text using his name? For many communities, that question mattered deeply. The second reason is chronology and canon formation. By the time Jewish communities were defining which texts were to be treated as sacred scripture, the Book of Enoch did not secure universal acceptance. It may have been respected, but respect is not the same as canon. The Hebrew Bible developed around books that were seen as carrying enduring covenantal authority. Enoch, for all its power and popularity, remained outside that core. Later, as Christians inherited the scriptures of Israel and reflected on which books were authoritative for the church, Enoch continued to face the same obstacle. It was known, discussed, even admired by some, but not widely received as inspired scripture across the broad Christian world. The third reason is theological and literary character. The Book of Enoch is intensely apocalyptic. It is full of visions, cosmic journeys, angelic hierarchies, symbolic judgment scenes, and elaborate supernatural explanations. For some believers, that made it profound. For others, it made it suspect. It felt too expansive, too visionary, too speculative. It did not read like Torah, history, prophecy, or gospel in the familiar sense. It stood at the edge of accepted revelation, and many leaders were cautious about granting scriptural status to a text so dense with extraordinary imagery. And there is another problem. Enoch often answers questions that the Bible leaves deliberately unanswered. Who were the beings in Genesis 6? Enoch answers. What exactly did the fallen angels do? Enoch answers. How did evil spread before the flood? Enoch answers. What happened to those angels afterward? Enoch answers. But some religious authorities saw that as a warning rather than a strength. Scripture is often restrained. Enoch is not restrained. It fills silence with detail. And that raised an uncomfortable possibility. Was the book preserving ancient truth, or was it building a dramatic system on top of a mystery the biblical text chose not to fully explain? That tension never disappeared. Another key reason Enoch remained outside the canon in most traditions is that its acceptance was never universal enough. Canon was not formed simply by asking whether a book was interesting, old, or spiritually impressive. Communities asked whether it was widely received, consistently used, doctrinally trustworthy, and linked to recognized prophetic or apostolic authority. On those questions, Enoch remained influential but vulnerable, and yet the story does not end there. Because Enoch was never completely lost, in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the Book of Enoch was preserved as scripture. While much of the Western world forgot it for centuries, Ethiopia kept it alive. That fact alone changes how we should talk about this subject. The book was not simply erased from history, it survived, just not in the center of most Christian canons. Then, centuries later, interest in Enoch exploded again when scholars rediscovered its fuller text and when fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The book suddenly looked less like a medieval curiosity and more like a serious witness to ancient Jewish thought. It became impossible to dismiss it as a late fantasy invented in total isolation. It clearly belonged to the intellectual and spiritual world surrounding early Judaism and early Christianity. That rediscovery is one reason modern audiences find it so compelling. The Book of Enoch feels forbidden but familiar, foreign but connected, outside the Bible, yet haunting its edges. It helps explain why so many people today are drawn to it. They hear about fallen angels. They hear about giants. They hear that the Bible barely hints at a cosmic rebellion, while Enoch opens the door much wider. And they ask the natural question, was this hidden from us? That is where serious investigation matters. The answer is not that a secret council simply buried Enoch because it revealed truths too dangerous to know. That makes for a dramatic story, but history is more complex. The book was debated because it occupied a strange position: ancient, influential, theologically rich, and deeply mysterious, but also disputed in authorship, expansive in speculation, and never universally received. So was it excluded because it was false? Not exactly. Was it excluded because it was dangerous? Not exactly. Was it excluded because it challenged the boundaries of accepted revelation? Now we are getting closer. The Book of Enoch survived in a zone of tension, too important to ignore, too controversial to canonize universally, too powerful to disappear completely. And perhaps that is why it still fascinates people now, because it sits just outside the door of the Bible, close enough to touch the story, but distant enough to remain mysterious. It speaks into one of the most haunting passages in Genesis. It influences how many people understand the fallen angels. It echoes in Jude. It resonates with themes of judgment, corruption, rebellion, and cosmic order. But for most traditions, it never crossed the final threshold into canon. And that leaves us with the real conclusion. The Book of Enoch was not pushed aside because it had no value. It was left outside the canon in most traditions because value alone was never enough. A book could be influential without being inspired scripture. It could be respected without being canonized. It could shape the imagination of believers without becoming part of the Bible itself. That distinction is crucial, and maybe that is what makes Enoch so powerful even now. It is not merely a lost book. It is a boundary book, a book that forces us to ask where scripture ends, where tradition begins, and how ancient believers tried to understand mysteries the biblical text only hints at. So why was the Book of Enoch removed from the Bible? The most honest answer is this. In most traditions, it was not so much removed as never fully accepted into the canon to begin with. It remained important, influential, and controversial, but it did not achieve the level of universal recognition needed to stand alongside the books most communities received as scripture. And yet its story never died. Because the deeper question was never just about one ancient book. It was about forbidden knowledge, fallen angels, the corruption of the ancient world, and the fear that some mysteries were never meant to be explained too easily. Now I want your honest opinion. Do you believe the Book of Enoch should have been included in the Bible, or do you think its exclusion protected the canon from speculation and confusion? Write your answer in the comments and tell me why. I really want to see which side you're on. And if you enjoy serious biblical mysteries like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and help this project keep growing. Your support allows us to continue exploring the darkest, most controversial, and most fascinating mysteries surrounding Scripture. Until the next mystery, keep reading carefully, keep questioning deeply, and never ignore the texts that history left standing just outside the gate.